Hello, everyone. I'm Ian Merkel, a visiting assistant professor of history at the University of Miami. As we move our courses online, I decided I'd make brief introductions to major historical questions and make them available on YouTube for you. In this segment, I'll be talking about Brazil's first republic, the political and economic crisis of the 1920s, and the revolution of 1930 that brought Getúlio Vargas to power. Like any regime change, it was unexpected, but for some time the Brazilian population had been dissatisfied with what they saw as a corrupt and oligarchic political system. Disgruntled military officers known as the Tenentes, the lieutenants, had openly risen up against the state, and by that I mean the national government. And states other than São Paulo, where coffee was king, had become dissatisfied with an economic model largely favoring coffee exports. All of this led to a perfect storm in 1930, with Brazil reeling from the stock market crash of 1929, as was the rest of the world. The fact that Brazil's economy was geared toward international consumer markets made the crash of 1929 particularly severe. Not only did the price of coffee decline considerably, the ability for American and European consumers to purchase foreign goods all but collapsed. Since coffee accounted for nearly half, if not over half, of all of Brazil's exports, this rapid decline in overseas demand had deleterious effects on everything from employment to balances of trade, and really the economy as a whole felt this decline in overseas consumption. Right? So throughout the 1920s, a number of policies existed both at the state level and at the national level to valorize coffee. This would mean burning excess supplies to keep prices high and manipulating the Brazilian currency. Right? None of this, however, would be possible or sustainable in a world absent of consumers. Right? With the demand all but evaporating, the same tried and true policies from the 1920s, however contentious and debatable they were, really had no room anymore. So the time was ripe for the return of a centralized Jacobin republic, which Brazil had seen in the early days of its first republic in the 1890s, a republic much more geared towards national economic development than strictly aimed at international markets. Right? It's worth remembering that at the same time in the United States, free market Republicans suffered substantial losses in the elections of 1930. Any comparison between the two countries is of course inherently problematic, but the context in Brazil was in many ways similar. Even if the Republican from São Paulo, Julio Prestes, actually won the election of 1930 on a politics-as-usual platform, Getúlio Vargas's Liberal Alliance provided the first real electoral challenge to the Republican political machines. For those of you who are not familiar with the Old Republic, this is often known as the Café con Leche Alliance, based on the fact that the political machines between São Paulo, coffee, and Minas Gerais, milk and dairy, leche, often, basically alternated presidencies. So let me just give you a sense of what the platform was of the Liberal Alliance. This is, of course, the losing electoral strategy that had Vargas as its presidential candidate, but that will ultimately come to power with Vargas, right? At least in discourse. And so here's the platform. We need to coordinate activities between the states and the federal government to study and adopt measures to create a national labor code. Both the urban and rural proletariat, and yes, they use the word proletariat, require instructional measures applied to both to address their respective needs. These measures include instruction, education, hygiene, diet, housing, protection of women and children, of invalids and old people, credit, salary relief, and even recreation, including sports and artistic culture. It's time to think of creating agricultural schools and industrial training centers, of making factories and mills safe, bringing sanitation to the countryside, constructing workers' villas, granting vacations, establishing a minimum salary, consumer cooperatives, and so forth." Unquote. So, Prestes, the politics as usual candidate, won the presidential vote by a margin of 18%. But less than 2 million of Brazil's 33.5 million people voted in that election. Historians continue to debate whether Vargas's Liberal Alliance represented popular opinion or only certain constituencies, but in any case, the revolution of 1930 brought about a coup d'etat that prevented Prestes from assuming the presidency. It united dissident elements in São Paulo around the Partido Democrático, the Democratic Party, regional elites in major states such as Minas Gerais, Rio Grande do Sul, and also Pernambuco, who sought to increase their control over the state and the economy, and a number of prominent military leaders throughout Brazil. The general population, too, was tired of politics as usual. I should say, however, that research still needs to be conducted about the popularity of the revolution of 1930. Again, I'm not making the claim that it was representative of popular opinion, broadly speaking, but at least a broad swath of the population did support this, right? So before getting to the revolution itself, it's worth stopping to describe Brazil's quote-unquote old republic and the broader political crisis of the 1920s that led to this, right? Whether as a Portuguese colony or as an independent nation, Brazil had been governed by the Bragança family, the royal family, for centuries. This came to an end with the military coup of 1889 that established Brazil's first republic. At first, it appeared that the republic might radically alter the structure of Brazil's political economy, particularly with positivists at its helm. But by the end of the 19th century, Brazil's first republic had settled on a more or less liberal model. That's to say, a decentralized government with increasing power given to the states and the market economy. Right? Suffrage was extremely low. Between 2 and 5% of the population could vote. And powerful political machines ran the country. Voting fraud was common. And of course, this is not unique to Brazil. This is a global phenomenon. At the end of the 19th century, we might think of Tammany Hall in New York, for example. And finally, basic protections for workers, consumers, and families were almost non-existent. This all started to come undone after 1917 with waves of strikes that started to politicize the high cost of living and poor working conditions, creating the impetus for laws that gave workers vacation time, regulated child labor, these kinds of things. The press increasingly critiqued the Republican political machines, calling them oligarchic, and really insisting on this word oligarchy. If you're interested in this period or this term and how it's being used politically, I'd recommend James Woodard's book, Place in Politics, about São Paulo. And new civic and political organizations emerged to push forth a reformist agenda. Most notably in São Paulo, we see the emergence of the Democratic Party in 1926, its founding, and the open advocacy for certain protections for industrial workers, and above all for the secret vote. It should be noted that elections already plagued by low suffrage and voting fraud were also marred by the fact that individuals did not vote anonymously. Especially in the countryside, voters were pressured, if not threatened, to vote for certain candidates. And historians such as Maria Ligia Prado, Maria Helena Capelato, they've rightly pointed to the fact that in practice, the Democratic Party was little different than these Republican political machines. But there was a very important element of reformist discourse, right? The constituencies as well of these parties, although overlapping in many ways, also point to a new middle class and also at the discursive level to a growing discontent with politics as usual. The tenentes, or lieutenants, were also crucial in the reformulation of the political process in the 1920s and through the Revolution of 1930. Not only did they openly revolt against the state, they ignited popular opinion, especially in cities. The election of 1921, for example, it pitted Arthur Bernanges, again, politics as usual, which meant coffee valorization, decentralization, the continuation of this free market export economy, right? This election pitted this kind of politics against a growing quote-unquote Republican reaction supported by reformists and a significant portion of the military. By republic, I mean this with the lowercase r, a renewed vision for what Brazil's republic meant. So, although Bernardes, the kind of political machine candidate, won, a clear split emerged between the elite export-oriented political machines and certain plebeian and progressive elements of society. The latter included the military, or at least parts of the military, which saw its honor tarnished by the corrupt civilian Bernardes administration. And so the revolt of the fort of Copacabana, this is in Rio de Janeiro, in 1922 represented the opening salvo, in which a number of lieutenants decided to take on government forces. Although quickly put down, the memory lived on, and 2 years later, an attempted revolution, this one much more significant, took place. So in 1924, the rebels, the lieutenants, some of whom had taken part in the revolt of 1922, they took control over the capital of São Paulo and parts of Rio Grande do Sul before marching north in what is commonly known as the Prestes column, named after Luis Carlos Prestes. In fact, historians point to this as the Miguel Costa Luis Carlos Prestes column because it was very much a dual-led column, but Prestes, not the Prestes who won in the election, but in this case the lieutenant, became Brazil's most famous communist, so we often think of it as the Prestes column. In any case, this column of disgruntled military officers and foot soldiers, as well as people throughout the country that joined their movement, they marched some 24,000 kilometers through Brazil's backlands, all the way up into the Amazon, deep into the Amazon. And what this did, even if they had small numbers, say 1,500, maximum people at a time, is it left the Brazilian state on edge. Imagine an armed band of over 1,000 people wandering around any country, right? So their 2-year-long expedition was followed by the press, and it garnered significant support. So for these 2 years, it traversed Brazil, and it was not put down. Obviously, the column was a little bit less popular among the people whose resources they depended upon, right? They needed to extract or provision themselves with farmers and different communities along the way. But in any case, at a national level, in terms of the press, this kept the critique of the present government going, right? And beyond their political relevance in a broader sense, the tenentes, such as Isidoro Dias Lopes, the marshal of the Revolution of 1924, they were crucial in effectuating the military coup d'etat that brought Vargas to power in 1930. The hope by many, military and civilian alike, was that the revolution of 1930 would bring about a more democratic, less corrupt, and more dignified government. Of course, different supporters wanted different things. The working classes, increasing protections against the rising cost of life, and control over their own labor. The middle classes, a more transparent political and economic system free of the oligarchy. and the military a renewed presence as a leader in public affairs, more akin to the role that they played during the early years of the Republic. There were also basic conflicts at a national level about Sao Paulo's monopoly of political power. It had been the second candidate in a row that Sao Paulo ran as president. Perhaps if there had been a non-Paulista candidate other than Julio Prestes, the revolution of 1930 might not have broken out. But there was also the very serious problem of economic crisis, which basically threw out the possibility of politics as usual. So in any case, what we see through this revolution is the end of the First Republic, which had governed from 1889 through 1930. And we will see from here on out, at least until 1945, but arguably much longer, a much more centralized national government, at least interested in, if not actively supporting, some kind of national economic development program. The provisional government, this is in 1930 when the coup brings the military leaders to power, promised to administer new elections, but it ultimately increasingly gave power to Getúlio Vargas, the leader, dashing hopes of many liberals and progressives alike that had brought him to power. That is another story, of course, but what's important to remember here is that the economic crisis of 1929 created the conditions of possibility for new political forms and economic and social organization. Vargas's co-option of the labor movement, his anti-democratic consolidation of power, were far from inevitable. But what was clear is that the politics as usual under the corrupt old regime were never to return. And also, incidentally, the First Republic, also known as the Estados Unidos do Brasil, the United States of Brazil, had become history. Next time, I'll consider the Vargas regime as a whole, the dictatorial new state that consolidated its power and its economic and social organization, and also the question of populism, which is so important to our own times. I'll also consider cultural politics insofar as the arts and education are concerned. But as for the revolution of 1930, just to close on this, it's important to remember that it did not have any clear ideology upon coming to power. That would take years of experimentation and co-option to emerge, as well as the changing politics of the world in which fascism, communism, and New Deal democracy emerged as important models, but also as trade partners and potential allies. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope that you enjoyed it.